In the heart of Mitchell's Plain, where dusty streets bear witness to lives hardened by crime, poverty, and survival, two brothers were born into a world few could escape from unscathed. Mogamat Sadeka Madat, the elder, and his younger sibling, Kaldimola Dimes Madat, would one day rise to notoriety within the shadowy underbelly of Cape Town's ganglands. Their surname, Madatt, would become synonymous with fear, power, and eventual bloodshed, etched in the annals of the city's criminal history.
We get rid of any enemy who enters our area.
Definitely.
Without a doubt, 50% chance he'll die. 50% chance he'll wind up in hospital. It will always be one of those two options.
Growing up in a township where the scent of dread lingered like smog, the Madatt brothers had little in the way of conventional opportunity. What they had instead was proximity to power, not the political kind, but the raw, volatile street power wielded by the Americans gang, one of the most feared and entrenched gangs on the Cape Flats. From a young age, the boys were groomed not only by their environment, but by older figures in the gang hierarchy, who saw promise in their ambition and loyalty. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, both Sadeka and Dimes had entrenched themselves in the operations of the Americans, particularly the faction known as the Ex-Americans. Their rise coincided with a turbulent era of gang warfare that saw territories being drawn and redrawn in blood, with extortion rackets, drug networks, and assassinations becoming the daily rhythm of life. Dimes, known for his sharp street instincts and ruthless decision-making, was often considered the more feared of the two, while Sadeka projected a quieter, but no less dangerous authority. Dimes Madatt survived more than 17 attempts,
This is exactly where they attacked me. I played dead. Put my arm over my head. They wanted to shoot me in the head, but only managed to get my hand. They thought I was dead. Took my weapon and ran off. And I'm still alive.
That's just one of 17 murder attempts. Dimes survived them all,
including some by Pagad in the late 1990s. Though both brothers were considered high-ranking members of the Americans' breakaway factions, they also carved out personal reputations. They were not merely soldiers, but tacticians. Their activities spanned Rocklands, Lentigur, and other areas on the Cape Flats, where they built networks that brought in illicit wealth and violent enemies in equal measure. But the criminal underworld is rarely a place of lasting power. By the 2010s, shifts in gang alliances, turf wars, and betrayals began to erode the once solid foundation the Madatt brothers had helped build. Whispers grew that Dimes had gone too far in his brutal methods, making enemies within rival gangs and even within the Americans' own divided ranks. Sadeka, older and more measured, tried to keep a low profile, but the weight of their past and the chaos of the present would eventually catch up with them both. As law enforcement cracked down on gang activity and the streets simmered with tension, the Madatt name was no longer spoken with mere reverence, it was now spoken with anticipation. People asked not if the brothers would be killed, but when. And in the world they lived in, such expectations were rarely wrong. The stage was set. Two men, once kings of the Cape Flats, were now marked by the very code they had lived by. Live by the gun, die by the gun. By 2022, Kaldimola Dimes Madatt's name still echoed with fear across the Cape Flats, but the empire he had helped build was starting to crumble beneath his feet. Once a prominent enforcer and leader within the Ex-Americans, a breakaway faction of the infamous Americans gang, Dimes had lived by a brutal code, but now he was beginning to die by it. Dimes had long been known for his fierce reputation and unapologetic violence. His operations in Rocklands and Lentigur were marked by extortion rackets, narcotics distribution, and calculated attacks on rival gangsters. But with each passing year, his list of enemies grew, not just outside the Americans, but within it. On Sunday, November 6, 2022, Dimes received a phone call that confirmed what he may have already suspected. people were coming to kill him. He and his bodyguard had just stepped out of a house on Northwest Street in Rockland's Mitchell's Plain when death arrived in full force. According to sources, a white Toyota Etios and a red Bakkie pulled up. As many as 7 shooters jumped out and opened fire in a blaze of bullets. Dimes was struck 11 times, his body riddled with gunfire, and collapsed on Monsoon Road. He died at the scene. His bodyguard, though wounded in the ambush, survived and was quickly taken away by members of the SAP's anti-gang unit. SAP's spokesperson Joseph Swartbooi later confirmed the details. Mitchell's Plain police responded to a complaint on Sunday the 6th of November 2022. Upon arrival in Monsoon Road at around 12:45 p.m., they found the body of a 56-year-old male who sustained multiple gunshot wounds. The sheer scale and precision of the hit left little doubt this was not a random attack. According to gangland sources, the assassination was an internal hit. Dimes had allegedly been marked for death at least a week earlier, but the initial attempt had been aborted. This time, the killers followed through. Whispers suggested Dimes had crossed too many lines, perhaps even defied orders from higher-ups within the Americans' fractured leadership. Some said he had become uncontrollable, a threat to the gang's shifting balance of power. Others pointed to internal disputes over turf and money.
I is the only one who can take one of our members out, and that is...
Whatever the motive, the message was clear. Not even a top lieutenant like Dimes was untouchable. The streets of Rocklands buzzed with tension in the aftermath. The community, long accustomed to bloodshed, held its breath. Retaliation seemed inevitable, but for Mogamat Sadeka Madat, Dimes' older brother and longtime partner in crime, the killing was more than business, it was personal. While law enforcement ramped up their presence and gang units kept watch, Sadeka quietly began retreating from the public eye. But insiders knew. The elder Madat would not let this go unanswered. Still, there are rules in the underworld. On Monday, the 1st of April 2024, the streets of Mitchell's Plain once again echoed with the sound of gunfire. This time it was Mogamat Sadeka Madat, sometimes spelled Mogamat Sadeka Madat, who became the latest casualty in Cape Town's endless gang wars. Shot in the Captain's Clip informal settlement, Sadeka's life came to a violent end after decades in the underworld. He was rushed to the hospital, but the wounds were too severe. He was declared dead shortly after arriving. With his death, the last of the infamous Madatt brothers was gone. Sadeka's killing didn't come out of nowhere. It was rooted in a web of betrayal, bloodshed, and criminal rivalry stretching back nearly 2 decades. While the Americans' gang once stood nearly unchallenged, internal fractures, violent leadership disputes, and territorial losses had weakened its grip over time. The Fancy Boys, a rising and methodical gang, were suspected of orchestrating the hit on Sadeka. Known for their expansionist strategy, they had begun capitalizing on fragmentation within larger groups like the Americans, and eliminating veteran figures like Madat was part of that rise. Tensions spiked immediately across Mitchell's Plain. Law enforcement had already flagged the area due to escalating violence, and Sadeka's murder raised fears of a full-scale war between the Fancy Boys and what remained of the Americans. Residents braced for more bloodshed gun battles, retaliation, and the possible unraveling of any fragile peace left in the Cape Flats. But to understand why Sadeka was killed, one must look back to 2007, the year the first major cracks appeared in the Americans' leadership. In late October 2007, the murder of a gangster known as Chara shocked Cape Town's criminal underworld. Days later, Marky Mokes Williams, another prominent Americans member, was also gunned down. Whispered accusations quickly pointed to Sadeka Madat as the mastermind behind Williams's killing. The streets buzzed with rumors that one of Sadeka's henchmen had pulled the trigger. That hit, prosecutors later argued, would become the spark for one of the bloodiest gangland attacks in Cape Town's history, the Woodstock Massacre. On the 5th of November 2007, 5 people were executed and several taxis set alight in Woodstock. The massacre occurred on premises owned by Sadeka himself, a transport business that doubled as a gang hub. It was widely believed to be retaliation for the earlier killings and symbolized the explosive collapse of unity within the Americans. A 2010 Western Cape High Court judgment would later confirm what many had long suspected, that a violent power struggle had erupted within the gang, particularly over control of drug territories. The facts that the state allege is that a conflict situation arose amongst the leaders of the American gang with regard to control over certain drug territories, the court noted. It alleged that an alleged American gang leader, Madatt, was suspected of orchestrating the killing of Marky Mokes, with a suspicion that one of Madatt's henchmen had actually shot Marky Mokes. The Woodstock massacre became a turning point. By 2008, Sadeka had already been convicted on charges related to diamond and drug trafficking and was expected to serve a decade in prison. But even behind bars, his influence lingered. By the time he resurfaced in the 2010s, the criminal landscape had changed. The Americans were splintered, riddled with rival factions and betrayal. Into this chaos stepped the Fancy Boys, an upstart group that learned from the failures of their predecessors. Unlike the Americans' old-school campaign of brute force, the Fancy Boys had crafted a new kind of empire. They exploited the weaknesses of fractured gangs, recruited disillusioned foot soldiers, and offered better wages, drugs, and firepower. In many ways, they mirrored how the Americans themselves rose to power in the 1980s and 90s, but with a modern, more calculated twist. A report on gang dynamics noted, the Fancy Boys have exploited the internal conflict of rival gangs and developed an atypical strategy, offering higher wages, more drugs, and better and permanent weapons to create a more attractive environment for gangsters and aspiring gangsters. This strategic empire-building part seduction, part force, slowly ate away at what was left of the Americans' dominance. Sadeka, already a relic of a crumbling dynasty, stood in the way of that momentum. His execution was not only retribution, but a clean break from an era of criminal leadership that had outlived its time. And so, in the dusty corners of a Mitchell's Plain informal settlement, the last of the Madatt brothers fell not in a grand shootout or a courtroom drama, but quietly, efficiently, and with finality. In life, Mogamat Sadeka Madatt and his brother Dimes ruled through fear and firepower. In death, they became footnotes in a changing underworld, one where loyalty is transactional, and legacy means nothing if you can't defend it. The streets remember them, but the streets move on.